Right. Today we are talking about a career in DevOps. How do you start a career in DevOps? If you're already in a DevOps career, how to progress in it? If you are in any other IT related domain, how do you switch? If you belong to a non-IT background, how can you make the switch to a DevOps role? We are going to talk about all of this. Apart from this, we will also talk about what are the skills, absolute minimum skills that DevOps engineers need, what are the things DevOps engineers do, and how to go about learning different DevOps tools and practices, and how to go about acquiring skills related to DevOps. So it's going to be a long video, so yeah, buckle up. Let's talk about what is DevOps. Before we go about talking about how to get into DevOps or progress in a DevOps career, we first need to talk about what is DevOps. Let's get down to the basics and discuss what actually is DevOps and what do you mean by the term DevOps, and not just from a terms perspective, as in like what is the term DevOps means, but also from a practical perspective, like when you talk about DevOps, what are the things actually you are talking about? And when you talk about a DevOps engineer, what are the things that a DevOps engineer can do? So let's talk about DevOps first. Now, there are various definitions in the market when it comes to DevOps. Some of them are, it is a set of tools. So some people say DevOps is a set of tools. Some people say DevOps is a role in a team, like a DevOps engineer. This is a role or a work profile. And some people say it is a philosophy. It's not a tool, it's not a process, it's not a role, it is a philosophy that teams acquire, which help them deliver software. And some people say it is a way in which you break silos between dev and operations. It's kind of a bridge between dev and operations. So various definitions. Apart from this, there are several other definitions that are there in the market. So we'll try to explore all these definitions and see what is right and what exactly is DevOps. See, from my perspective, all these definitions are correct to a certain extent. And while all of them don't address every aspect of DevOps, but they are still correct. So let's go through one by one. Let's explore the definition. DevOps is a set of tools. DevOps is certainly a set of tools, and you cannot implement DevOps without tools. But calling DevOps just the tools will not really cover the entire gamut of what DevOps comprises of. Tools is just one part of it, which helps you implement DevOps. But DevOps is much more than just tools. How about CI/CD? DevOps is CI/CD. If I'm doing continuous integration, if I'm using Jenkins, I'm doing DevOps. Absolutely, you are doing part of DevOps. But DevOps is not just CI/CD. CI/CD is a part of DevOps, is one of the processes, and for that matter, one of the very important processes of DevOps. But if you just do continuous integration or even continuous delivery, you are not utilizing DevOps to its full potential. So DevOps is much more than just CI/CD. How about breaking the silos between dev and operations? Absolutely. DevOps breaks silos, it breaks these individual teams which work in their own area of influence without much communication and interaction between the other teams, and work with only some kind of handshake mechanism. DevOps aims to break these. But is it really dev and operations? Does DevOps affect only these two teams? I don't think so. While, say, 10 years back, when DevOps was, as a term, was still getting explored, software development was still at a very simpler stage than what it is now. Software development is much more nuanced and complex these days. And when we talk about teams, giving the primary importance of just the development and operations team is not fair. There are several other teams and roles that are involved in the software delivery process. What about the networking team? What about the database team? What about the storage team or the security team or the testing team? They also are a very integral part of the DevOps process and software delivery process. And DevOps, when done correctly, aims to break silos between all these teams and not just development and operations. So yeah, DevOps sure does break silos, but all across teams. How about DevOps is not a role, it is a philosophy? Of course, some aspects of DevOps like collective ownership and transparency and collective ownership can have a little philosophical angle to it, but then they all can be translated into black and white, and in case of software development, 0 and 1. So while there are philosophical aspects to DevOps, you still need tools to implement them. You still need people with these roles to implement them. So DevOps is certainly a philosophy, but it is also a team, it is also a role, it is also tools, it is also process, and much more. So again, just sticking to the philosophical aspect doesn't do much service to the entirety of DevOps as a term. So then what is DevOps if all these definitions are not correct and are not fulfilling its entire definition? So in my view, and this is something that I have kind of developed over a period of time with my experiences with DevOps, and I'll read it out word by word because I don't want to miss out on things. DevOps combines people, tools, processes, primarily automating software delivery. It helps you deliver your software in a safer way. SAFER is an acronym which I have come up with. It essentially comprises of 5 things, which is secure, automated, fast, error-free, and repeatable. In my view, this is the primary goal of DevOps. Of course, we are talking about software delivery. DevOps focuses on software delivery, but DevOps also focuses on how you are doing that software delivery. And it touches 5 aspects. And if you are doing software delivery in a secure, automated, fast, error-free, and repeatable way, I feel you're doing DevOps the right way. So this is the definition of DevOps. Now, let's discuss why DevOps is such a challenging, rewarding role, and why people think that it is very difficult to be a good DevOps engineer, or DevOps is a very difficult role to pick up and learn. Let's go through some of the points on why DevOps can be considered as challenging or rewarding, whatever way you want to look into it. First is DevOps doesn't have a very defined definition in every organization. When you talk about tester, you know exactly what the testers do. Like they would ideally be writing test cases, running regression tests, or load tests, stress tests, in some cases manual tests as well. But that profile is very defined. It might differ a little bit from when it comes to, say, front end, back end, or mobile. But the whole idea remains the same. When you see a tester, you know exactly. But when you say DevOps, a DevOps can have different roles in different companies. For example, in one company, a DevOps engineer might be just focusing on CI/CD pipelines and will not touch anything else. In some companies, they might be focused only on cloud infrastructure as code, and not do anything else. In other companies, they might have a lot of focus on system side of things, like creating standard operating environments and operating system and patching and things like that. In some companies, they might have a lot of bias towards security and identity and access management and authentication and authorization side of things. In some companies, it can be a combination of all these things. A DevOps engineer might be doing application deployments, CI/CD deployments, and also taking about, say, application performance or APM or some bit of SRE. And in some organizations, it might be a mix of system engineering and security and IAM. So what I'm trying to get at is different companies have specialized team that can take care of various aspects of DevOps, or they can have DevOps roles or engineers that can take care of one or multiple aspects of the various things that come under the purview of DevOps. So DevOps as a role is not very consistent across teams and industries. So that's one challenge. Apart from that, dynamics of every organization is different. How people do DevOps in different organizations differs. There is no one solution that works for every organization. Some organizations have their own inbuilt solution, which they use to implement and carry out DevOps processes. Some use third-party vendors, some use software as a service, some use some cloud provider on software as a service. At some places, it's a mix of homegrown tools and third-party vendors. So there is no one type of solution that fits all companies. So DevOps in every organization is very unique. You might be a DevOps engineer in one organization and you go to a new organization and you might be doing completely different things. It's quite possible. So that is also one challenge in which DevOps is not the same for every organization. When I mean is not the same, I don't mean from the perspective of definition of DevOps. I mean from the perspective of implementation. Like DevOps remains the same for every organization, but how they implement it, the tool chain, the processes, and how is the team structure and the hierarchy, who owns what is the responsibility of each teams of various part of these processes might differ from organizations to organization. And that is a big challenge. Apart from that, if you really talk about DevOps at a very in-depth way, DevOps spreads deep and wide. The amount of tools, processes, tool chains, and they keep changing every alternate year is huge. And that adds to the challenge and complexity of being DevOps. You picked up one tool, you became a master of it, and within 2 years it is redundant and some other tool has replaced it. And add to that the things that AI is bringing these days. So DevOps is a process that is spread far wide and deep. So that also is a challenge when it comes to DevOps as a practice. Tool sprawl, I already talked about. A company can have one solution implemented using a couple of tools, or it can be a solution implemented with 20 different tools. There are setups in which the same company uses different set of tools for different set of teams because teams have their own preferences. Not an ideal scenario, but it happens, and it happens rampantly. You would be surprised how many companies have that setup in which various teams use various different tools. So tool sprawl is a challenge. The amount of tools, and you can go in hundreds when it comes to DevOps tools that are still relevant in the market, are in popular use. So that is a challenge. So all these things that I just talked about add to the complexity and challenge of DevOps as a practice. Now let's talk about what do DevOps engineers do. We talked about what is DevOps. We talked about the challenges of DevOps as a process, as a role, as a profession. But what do actually DevOps engineers do? Now, the role of DevOps engineers have evolved over a period of time. 10 years back, build, release, packaging, deployment, and that's it. But now DevOps engineers are exposed to a lot other things, and sometimes they have to carry about a lot of other roles and processes and tools and responsibilities in order to implement DevOps. So let's take a look at what do DevOps engineers do. Now, before we get to that, as I said earlier, various companies have specialized teams and team members and roles doing various aspects of DevOps. For example, companies might have dedicated system engineers who take care of only the system engineer aspects. But there might be companies where DevOps engineers do it. Same applies to security, identity and access management, authentication, authorization, networking, landing zones, cloud infrastructure, FinOps. There are dedicated teams in some companies, SRE, logging, monitoring, application performance management. All these can be carried out by dedicated teams, but then DevOps engineers also might be the ones taking care of these responsibilities. Not one, multiple, maybe all of them. I've worked in such roles in which, starting from setting up the base infrastructure like cloud landing zone to application performance monitoring and everything in between, taking care of production, and everything in between is taken care of by one person or a DevOps engineer or one team who are exposed to all these aspects of DevOps. So let's go one by one as to what are the various aspects that DevOps engineers might be doing. The first thing we are discussing is applications. Now, the primary role or the thing that it all began was how to build, package, and deploy applications. And more often than not, DevOps engineers are responsible for these aspects. And when I say application, I mean how an application built, packaged, tested, and deployed and maintained. So I'm talking about CI/CD pipelines, in which right from checking in your code into your source codes management system to deploying to your production environment, how it is tested, goes through various stages of the software development lifecycle. DevOps engineers get to manage these CI/CD pipelines. They also are the joint owners of how the product is built, like the build scripts. Of course, the developers are primary owners, but if something needs to be added to the build scripts, or how we call these build scripts, if something goes wrong, some dependency needs to be added, DevOps engineers have to be across that. So build scripts are what DevOps engineers own. Same applies to packaging, how we package it. What is the payload that gets deployed to? Is it an application server, or is it just a web server or a website or a content management system or a mobile application or just a standalone exe or a jar file which serves production workloads? What is the payload, how you package it and how you run it and where you run it and how do you configure it? All application related things are what DevOps engineers need to be aware of. Now, of course, developers are probably the primary owners of it, but more often than not, DevOps engineers need to be really expert in these aspects of application. Then automation, of course. How are you automating these various stages of the pipeline, like building, testing, certification, and then deployment, and then progressing across the environments? So DevOps engineers have to take care of automation. Of course, all these things are not done manually. Some aspects might be manual in some organizations, but the responsibility of automating them and owning that automation lies with DevOps engineers. I already talked about deployments, how these are deployed, where they are deployed, how do you configure these deployments either to a web server or an application server like Tomcat or Nginx or IIS, or just Kubernetes or container deployments, things like that. That brings us to the containerization part of it. If your application is running on containers, how it is packaged, how these containers are made, how efficiently you package them, these all, again, have joint ownership between development and DevOps engineers. And DevOps engineers, more often than not, need to know much more than what a developer might know as to how the things are packaged and then running it in a container orchestrator like say ECS or Kubernetes or any of the managed Kubernetes that the cloud vendors provide, how it is deployed and built, a DevOps engineer need to be across that. Artifacts, how these artifacts are stored, versioned, purged, maintained, and promoted across environments. DevOps engineers need to be aware of that. And that is not even a joint responsibility with the dev team. It is the primary ownership of the DevOps teams as to how you manage these artifacts. And not just build artifacts, it can be testing artifacts as well. It can be other artifacts like test results and things like that, which provide you a consistent view of what is the status of the build or software development process in various stages. And DevOps engineers are responsible in managing these artifacts and in managing this entire automation that generates these artifacts and kind of stores and manages these artifacts. Middle tier backend, of course, there are dedicated teams to manage that. But when you are deploying your application and it is interacting with various other software, be it a message queue or a database in the backend, DevOps engineers need to be aware of how all those connectivity work. And if something is broken somewhere, more often than not, DevOps engineers come into the play in which they help troubleshoot. So a DevOps engineer has to be across all these tools and how they are configured and how they interact with your application deployment process. So these are all the application related things that a DevOps engineer is exposed to. Now comes the systems aspect of things. When I say systems, I mean operating systems. If you are a Linux shop or a Windows shop, what is your standard operating environment? When it comes to Linux, if you are running, say, cloud infrastructure, how do you generate your AMIs and what kind of security hardening that you have done and what are the prerequisites that your applications needs and what are the packages? And you might not be generating a standard operating environment or a SOE for only your application. You might be doing it for multiple other applications in the enterprise. So DevOps engineers need to be across that. And more often than not, they are responsible for the pipelines that generate these, be it the Packer scripts, or if you are doing configuration management, once you have provisioned the AMI, probably running some kind of Ansible scripts to set those up, things like that. So DevOps engineers are responsible for that. Networking. Of course, you have dedicated network engineers, but these days, to be a great DevOps engineer, you have to be a great network engineer as well. So DevOps engineers need to be network engineers too. How are your DNS set up? What are the different siders or subnets? And when things were running on-prem, DevOps engineers, or whatever it was called during those time, or even now in on-prem setups, are probably not that exposed to these aspects or networking aspects, and you have dedicated network engineers that takes care of things. But as and when things have started moving to cloud, DevOps engineers are getting exposed to networking aspects more and more. So as a DevOps engineer, you have to understand the various networking infrastructure that is in place and comes in play when it comes to network connectivity across environments, and how with firewall and other heightened security postures, it adds more complexity to it. And as a DevOps engineer, you have to understand that. So networking is one of the things, very important things that the DevOps engineers should know. Tools administration. So of course, a lot of the tools administration these days is taken care of by third-party vendors as well. And by that, I mean software as a service, because we use more and more software as a service. Like nobody hosts their own Git server anymore, and some people do. But yeah, back in the day, if you have been in DevOps or a similar line, as long as I have been, you would remember that clear case administration or say TFS administration was a defined role and a very coveted role, and tools administration was a very important part of that role, and it is still there. Even if you are not administering the tools firsthand, can, but you still are responsible for the configuration, the connectivity, the setting up of SSO or the permissions and authentication, authorizations. DevOps engineers need to know all that. So yeah, this is also one aspect that is pretty important to DevOps engineers. Configuration management. Yes, once you have set up your infrastructure, several shops have more complex setups. Like when you spin up your instance, you do multiple other configurations. So it can be either Ansible, Puppet, Chef. So DevOps engineers are responsible for configuration management as well, be it just your application related or be it the infrastructure related, which the DevOps relies on. So configuration management is also an important aspect of DevOps engineering. So these are all the things that are related to systems. Now, as I said, some organizations have dedicated engineers that takes care of just these things. But then more and more organizations have DevOps roles and DevOps engineers that take care of all these things. Now let's talk about security. Of course, as I said, there are dedicated teams that take care of security aspects of DevOps, but DevOps engineers also need to be aware of security tooling, security posture, vulnerability assessment, and things like that. That's why DevOps now is increasingly not just called DevOps, it's called DevSecOps. And it is more DevSecOps than DevOps. If you are not aware of security, I'm afraid to break the news to you, you might be becoming irrelevant pretty fast, because security is a huge thing. And when I talk about security, I'm talking about identity and access management. How do you manage your identity when it comes to workforce identity as well as your customer identity? And tools like Azure Intra or Entra, which was Azure AD before, or Okta or Auth0, things like that. How do all these integrate with your tool chain? Setting SSO, setting up permissions, IAM, and what level of granularity does your permissions have, and how do they translate to application configuration and tools configuration? DevOps engineers need to know all these things. Then comes application security. I'm talking about SSL, I'm talking about certificate. How is your certificate infrastructure set up? If you're using private CA or public CA, how do you generate these certificates? What is the life cycle of these certificates? What kind of automation have you set up for these certificates? How do certificates are granted or replaced once they expire, and things like that? Of course, there are dedicated teams in some shops who take care of these things, but DevOps engineers need to know all these things. Secrets management, when it comes to application secrets, configuration secrets, how do you manage them? How do you recycle them? How are they tied to your entire CI/CD pipeline? DevOps engineers need to be aware of that. Be it just-in-time security, in which you are generating tokens for either applications or individual users to log in or access systems, or other kind of security which your application uses. DevOps engineers need to be aware of that and need to manage that in most of the cases. And not just these, vulnerability assessment, tools like Snake or Veracode or Checkmarks or Nexus, what kind of security and vulnerability assessment that you do? Is it software composition analysis? When you create your software, what kind of third-party software or open source library it is dependent on what kind of vulnerability they are introducing in your software? So those aspects, and just writing code, does your code contains vulnerability? Not just that, your infrastructure or the systems that is running your application, what kind of vulnerability they have, your network security, your infrastructure as code security. All these aspects are very important for DevOps engineers, and DevOps engineers need to know these aspects. So these are the security aspects that DevOps engineers need to be aware of. Operations, things like logging and monitoring. Some organizations have dedicated team that are solely responsible for managing the logging and monitoring solutions. But DevOps engineers need to be aware of this setup. They not only need to be aware of this setup, they also need to manage and maintain it on an ongoing basis. Things like how the logs are ingested, what are the different sources from logs are ingested, what kind of transformation that is run on this data, and what kind of dashboarding and metrics that we collect and visualize, and setting up alerts and different kinds of notifications based on these metrics. These all come under the purview of DevOps these days. So tools like Elasticsearch, Logstash, Sumo Logic, Splunk, DevOps engineers need to know these tools and need to manage and maintain these tools. Apart from that, SRE is a dedicated role. So more often than not, there is a dedicated SRE team that takes care of production environment and ensures that the SLA for the application are met. But DevOps engineers more often than not are also involved in a lot of these SRE activities. And in most cases, DevOps engineers either work very closely with SRE engineers or are embedded in the same team. So it's very important for DevOps engineers to know various concepts of SRE and tools and automations around it. Apart from that, DevOps itself is a service that caters to internal customers. When I say DevOps, I mean the DevOps toolchain, the CI/CD pipeline. In fact, the CI/CD pipeline is supposed to be treated as a production artifact because your entire development pipeline is dependent on this sole set of tools. So if your pipeline is broken, your capability to deliver to production is under threat. So it is very important that a DevOps team or DevOps engineers provides support for these processes and tools, which means if somebody is not able to access some part of the tool chain or not able to make any changes or not able to run the pipelines or is anyway blocked because some of these tool chains within the pipeline, it is the responsibility and it is the ownership of DevOps engineers and DevOps teams to make sure they unblock different team members if they are facing issues. So these are the various operations related things that DevOps engineer must be aware of. Now, we talked about quite a few different things that DevOps engineers are responsible for. Let's talk about one more thing, which is a recent addition in the portfolio of ownership and accountability for DevOps engineers. And this is data engineering and MLOps. While there are dedicated data engineers and there are dedicated ML engineers or data scientists, DevOps engineers more often than not get involved in these activities as well. Because while data engineering in itself is a full-fledged role, a lot of the aspects that data engineering and MLOps depends on, like the base infrastructure or the landing zone or the various other cloud infrastructure like networking and pipelines and permissioning, IAM, authentication, authorization, things like that. A lot of this base infrastructure is provisioned, maintained, and supported by DevOps engineers. So the operations that an MLOps engineer or a data engineer carries out in order to perform their role, they need a lot of support from the DevOps engineers. And more often than not, I have seen that DevOps engineers move to these kind of roles in which they are doing data engineering roles or MLOps roles. So it is very important for DevOps engineers to understand these aspects, like how data is ingested, how the data goes through various levels of transformation, be it streaming data, be it data at rest, how the data is secured, authentication, authorization, how the data gets transformed from a raw layer to a state where it can be consumed either by reporting or by data science teams. So it is very important for DevOps engineers to understand data pipelines, data lakes, and data warehouses, and how these are managed and maintained, and how models go through various level of promotion and how they are managed and maintained. It is very important more and more in the current time for DevOps engineers to know these concepts. So there you have. These are all the things that DevOps engineers should be aware of, or should be responsible of, or should have exposure to. These are quite a few things, isn't it? So it can be a little overwhelming at the onset, thinking that there are so many things that a DevOps engineer should know. But all these skills can be picked up over a period of time. Now I'll go through some of the skill sets, like bare minimum. If you are someone who is starting a new role in DevOps, or is at the initial stages of their DevOps career, what are the bare minimum skills that you need for you to be able to perform your DevOps engineering duties? The first and foremost is cloud. Let's face it, while there are a lot of on-prem enterprise and solutions still going on in this IT industry, cloud is the most important thing that you can learn. And if you're not aware of cloud concepts, it's very unlikely that you will be able to succeed as a DevOps engineer. And from cloud, I don't mean any specific vendor like AWS or Azure or GCP or any of the other vendors. I mean any cloud vendor, like you either have exposure to AWS or Azure or GCP. You need to have an in-depth understanding, if not in-depth, at least a decent level of understanding of cloud concepts. What are the various services in cloud, how they integrate with each other, and how you can set up a DevOps toolchain and pipeline within this infrastructure, how you can deploy your workloads, how you can run your applications within this infrastructure, how to manage, maintain, and secure and scale this infrastructure. This is very important for DevOps engineers to know. So if you don't have cloud knowledge or cloud exposure, pick up one platform that you are most close to, or you have the most opportunity to pick up. Pick it up and spend some time to know about the cloud infrastructure. Next is operating system, either Linux or Windows, preferably Linux. Why? Because most of the workloads and most of the enterprises that I have worked with and I've seen people work in, Linux is a must. And if you have in and out understanding of a Linux operating system, it's very easy to translate that with Windows. Same applies to Windows as well. I started my career predominantly in the Windows environment and then moved to Linux. I would say that understanding of both the environments is important, but if you have to pick one, like you cannot pick both at a time. If you are starting new and you want to decide on one thing, pick Linux. Linux is the most important operating system that a DevOps engineer should be aware of. And when I say Linux, if you're starting somebody new, you don't have to have administrator level skills in Linux, but at least a advanced user level Linux know-how. That means you need to know what are the various file systems, how to create services, how to troubleshoot services, networking aspects, memory, RAM, disk, devices, shares, security, users, groups, permissions. These are all important concepts that every DevOps engineer should be aware of. I would also like to include things like package management and patching and things like that. These all are things that a DevOps engineer should be aware of. Programming language. Now, this is a very long discussion as to, do DevOps engineers need programming language? And the short answer is yes. You can still be a DevOps engineer without programming language. But let me tell you very clearly, you will not be able to grow or go far without knowledge of programming in DevOps. Why? Because everything that DevOps engineers these days do, be it infrastructure, be it security, be it application, be it pipeline, is all in code. There is no manual configuration anymore. Of course, there will be opportunities and areas where you will explore things manually or set up things manually. But more often than not, everything will eventually be converted to code. So if you are provisioning infrastructure as cloud, things like Terraform or CloudFormation or any other things like Pulumi, you need to be aware of. If you are provisioning server and you are doing additional configuration in this server, things like Ansible, Puppet, SaltStack, these will be important. And if you're doing automation, things like shell script. So this is just while carrying out DevOps task. Even if you're managing application pipelines where you're building packaging code, if a build fails, you have to understand what the build failure is. Why did the build fail? Was it a coding issue or was it some other infrastructure or package or some other issue? It is very important for DevOps engineers to know at least some bit of programming for which they are supporting processes for, which means if you are working in a Java shop where your applications is written in Java, you have to have at least basic understanding of Java. Same applies to things like Go or C++ or C#. Whatever programming language you are supporting, you need to have understanding at least in one programming language. And you don't need to pick up all these different programming languages at one go. Pick one language and have at least an in-depth understanding in that language. And that knowledge can be translated to every other programming language. So for example, if you are starting new and if you want to pick up one language, pick up Java. If you have good understanding in Java, picking up any other language like C#, Python, you will be able to understand as long as you understand the programming constructs, how the loops and conditions and variables and different programming constructs. If you understand the programming constructs and programming logic, you will be able to apply that in any other programming language. So yes, programming language is important, and without the knowledge of at least one programming language, there's not much you can do in DevOps. Version control. Now, version control is the backbone of a DevOps engineering process, be it GitHub, be it GitLab. These days, Git is the most popular version control tool. Back in the days, there were quite a few contenders when it comes to DevOps version control. And you had several tools that are in use like Perforce, ClearCase, SourceClear Vault, cPine Surround. Git came and settled the discussion of version control. And I think probably 90% of the software industry now uses Git. So it is very important for you to know Git concepts. How do you check in, check out, branch, merge, resolve conflicts, and things like that. I have seen people spend hours and days picking up Git as a skill, which is probably not important. You can spend just an hour or a couple of hours and pick up some basic concepts, which will give you 80% of what you need to know in Git. There will always be some fringe command or fringe use cases that you can always explore and find out more information when you hit that road. But understanding of Git concepts and understanding of version control concepts is very important for a DevOps engineer. Build tools. We get lost in a lot of cloud discussion and infrastructure discussion, but we have to understand that where it all started was DevOps engineers being build and release engineers. The primary role of, and in those times, DevOps engineers was build, release, packaging, deployment. So it is very important for somebody starting at the initial stages of DevOps engineering career to know at least one build tool. I would pick up anything between Gradle and Maven because these are the most common build tools that are in use. Back in the days, Ant, Nant, MS Build, these were pretty common, but yeah, if you know Maven or if you know Gradle, you should be good. If you have to pick one, pick Gradle, and Maven will make sense. And the same concept of programming language applies here as well. If you know one build tool in depth, you can apply that know-how to other build tools as well. So build tool, knowledge of build tool is very important for a DevOps engineer. Pipeline orchestration tool. And when I say pipeline orchestration tool, I mean a tool that ties the various tools of the DevOps tool chain and creates a pipeline, be it a continuous integration pipeline or continuous deployment or a delivery pipeline. And one tool that is used for orchestrating your pipeline is very important for a DevOps engineer to know. Be it Jenkins, be it GitHub Actions, take your pick. If you have to pick one, I would pick up anything between Jenkins or GitHub Actions. Jenkins is still the most popular tool used, but Jenkins is losing its ground day by day, and since pipelines are now more tightly integrated with the version control, so GitHub Actions is probably something you can pick if you are starting fresh. So knowledge of one pipeline orchestration tool is very important. And again, here if you see, I don't mean things setting manually. If you are picking up Jenkins, it doesn't mean manual jobs configuration or manual Jenkins job configuration. I mean pipeline as code. You have to be able to code a Jenkins pipeline, and same applies to GitHub Actions. There's no manual configuration. So yeah, GitHub Actions. So pipeline as code, and how do you orchestrate your build, packaging, deployment, testing, and create your CI/CD pipeline is very important for a DevOps engineer to know. Next comes containers and container orchestration. More and more applications these days are packaged and deployed as containers, and knowledge of Docker is very important. I would say it is one of the basic requirements of being a DevOps engineer. So technical know-how of how Docker works and how you create images and how you run containers, how you package and manage them. Container orchestration, of course, can get a little advanced, but if you have understanding of that, like Kubernetes or any of the managed Kubernetes services, it would be awesome. So containerization again is a basic building block of a DevOps engineer. So you see, these are the bare minimum skills that every DevOps engineer needs. Now let's discuss how can you pick up these DevOps skills. Either you are at the beginning of your career or you are at an advanced stage or an intermediate stage in your career. How do you go on picking new DevOps skills? Because when we were talking about what all things a DevOps engineer needs to know, you saw that there's a huge laundry list of things that a DevOps engineer should know. And it's practically impossible for somebody who is starting to have exposure and experience in all these things. So how do you go about building your toolkit of know-how when it comes to DevOps engineering? One is, of course, real-life projects. There is no substitute for on-job real-life experience. And more often than not, your job, the job that you are doing currently, will not give you exposure to all the aspects of a DevOps engineer. So you will have to dig deeper and find out projects, pet projects that you independently work on. And these days, anybody can have a cloud infrastructure. Like back in the day when things were in data center, getting access to various services was pretty difficult, and it was very unlikely for somebody to be exposed to various aspects of a DevOps engineering role, which is so easy now because everything is in cloud. You can just create an account in cloud and you can create the most complex of setups in that. And be always careful that you keep a track of what are the cost of the services and you don't create a big hole in your pocket when you're provisioning these expensive services, and you make sure that whenever you provision something, you destroy it. But what I'm trying to say is that even if your current job doesn't provide you the necessary exposure that you need to become a complete DevOps engineer, you can always find real life projects and use cases and implement them. And no amount of theoretical understanding or certification or YouTube videos is going to be a substitute for that learning. So pick up real projects, implement them, create your own GitHub account, create your own AWS account or Azure account or GCP account, and set up things from scratch. So that will give you a good exposure. Certifications is always useful. Certification has a hit and a miss thing. Don't expect that if you do certification, you will become a pro in implementation. When you start, because it's very easy to clear certification exams just by studying or mugging up things or putting hard hours in studying the various concepts. So what certification does is gives you exposure to various aspects of the topic. So if you are doing a certification in AWS or say Docker, you will understand the in and out of that topic. But you cannot replace hands-on experience with certification. So if somebody comes and tells that I have 2 years of experience in Docker and Kubernetes, and if somebody comes and say I have 0 experience but I have certification in Docker and Kubernetes, which one are you going to pick? Of course, the person with hands-on experience. And even if it is somebody who is starting fresh, just showing certification is not enough. It's certainly more than not having anything. Like if you say that I have read a book in Docker and Kubernetes, that doesn't help. But if you have a certification, that proves that you have some knowledge of the topic. But if you back that up with some real life project, even if it's a small project of your own, that I studied Docker and Kubernetes and created this small project, this is the GitHub link, this is what I'm doing, this is the architecture of the thing, this is the pipeline, this is how am I building the container and deploying and managing that. That has much more weightage than just certification. But certification are certainly an important arsenal in the toolkit. So don't ignore certifications, but don't rely on them too much as well. Online courses. These courses can be towards getting a certification or can be towards getting more know-how on the topic as well. Now, it's very important for you to pick up courses carefully because the amount of courses that is available right now online is huge. And with the proliferation of AI, there's a lot of junk that is out there. So you don't want to get stuck with a course which takes 30 hours for you to train in the basic concepts of Git. That is just ridiculous. So look at courses which have very good hands-on, which are concise, which have good coverage, so that it doesn't waste your time. You're not bogged down with endless chit-chat and content which probably is not relevant, and you are getting value fast. Also, don't just go for courses which have the maximum number of students. You will see that courses that cater to a wider audience are generally very basic in nature or very generic in nature. Pick up courses which are very specific to the topic that you are trying to pick up and see if they have good hands-on, the content is good. There is always some free lessons that you can see what kind of reviews the course has. And also when you are actually doing this course, try to listen them at a faster pace, like a 1.5x or 1.2x. 2x becomes too fast at times, but 1.5x I have seen is a very decent space in which you can cover. So curate your own list of courses which you can do. YouTube is also a very important source of information. But here is the catch. There are some content creators in YouTube you will see which have millions of followers and which have millions of views on videos. And I'm not saying they're bad videos, they are very good. But if you are counting on getting in-depth understanding on DevOps concepts, just going through some basic videos which has a lot of views probably doesn't cut it. So I have seen in YouTube I have seen several YouTube videos that are awesome, that have absolutely awesome content, but not very popular, not many views. So one of the very good examples is all these videos from the various events like AWS reInvent or Azure or Google events, A lot of these videos are online, and AWS, I would say, is one of the best examples here, in which they post all the videos of all the sessions. Some of these are really advanced, but some are very good, and I see not many people view these videos. So it's very important for you to curate your own content. Look around, look for various content creators and channels which provide these kind of videos, and curate your own content. So YouTube is a great place to learn about it, but you have to be a little careful as to where you invest your time. So now we covered what is DevOps, we covered what do DevOps engineers do, we covered how to build up DevOps skills, we covered what are the bare minimum of skills that DevOps engineers need. Now let's take a look at how do you switch your career to DevOps. Like, if you are already somebody in a IT career or a non-IT career and you want to make a switch into DevOps, how do you go about doing that? Let's talk about some examples of profiles which can be prospective candidates for making a switch to a DevOps career. Let's start with somebody who is absolutely new to IT and has no background in IT. Now, this switch is obviously going to be the most challenging one and most time-taking one, because you not only have to pick up on DevOps concepts, you also have to pick up on IT concepts, because a lot of the things that a DevOps engineer starts with, things like operating system, programming, and computer concepts, it is a given that they already know about it. But if you are from a non-IT background, you have to start from scratch. So you have to first go through just IT concepts of what are computers, computer language, hardware, software, databases, various aspects of computer language, programming, data structures, things like that. And you don't have to have in-depth understanding in all of things, but at least a basic understanding. Once you have that, then you can start picking up DevOps concepts. And when I say DevOps concepts, the things that I covered in the bare minimum skill sets that you need for DevOps engineers, which essentially are version control, cloud, some programming language, some pipeline tool, and build tool and containers. So these are the skills that you need to take. Now, as I mentioned, this will be the most time-taking switch to make, but I'm sure it will be worth it. Now, let's talk about somebody who is in system engineer's role and want to make the switch to a DevOps role. Now, this is much more easier switch because you already have understanding of computer concepts. You already are in an IT role. You already have exposure to some of the things that DevOps engineers should know, things like infrastructure or operating system or configuration management. You probably are already exposed to these concepts. And I'm also assuming you already know version control concepts and things like that. So the things that you need to focus on are on the application side of things, essentially the pipelines and CI/CD pipelines and orchestration and how the various pipelines tie up together. You'll have to pick up things on containerization maybe, and container orchestration and deployment. So these are the skills that you will need to pick up, which will augment your already existing skills that you have, and you can easily make the switch to a DevOps role. Now let's talk about developers and testers. Now, while it is not a very common thing that developers and testers switch to a DevOps role, but it is not uncommon as well. I have talked and seen some testers specifically who want to make the switch to DevOps. And it is also pretty easy for them because they also have already an understanding of the application side of things, like how the pipelines works and testing and how packaging and deployment works. They already have a base understanding of various related great concepts. What they will need to pick up more on is probably a little bit on the infrastructure side of things, system engineering and networking and security, and probably a little bit on the cloud side of things. So these are the things that they need to focus on more. They already probably will have the exposure to pipeline orchestration and source control, so which will be very handy when they make the switch to a DevOps role. Now let's talk about graduates from an IT background. Now, this probably is one of the biggest group of folks which would be interested in trying to explore a career in DevOps. And again, it is not very challenging to start because the number of roles at the starting level are huge. Of course, as I said, people talk about experience, I need on-job training. But as I mentioned, getting an exposure of equivalent to on-job training is not difficult these days with the access that you have to cloud infrastructure. And you can build, create your own solutions, your own DevOps platforms as your pet project or test projects, which will augment your understanding of the IT knowledge that you have, which will help you to get a job in a DevOps role. So any IT grad will already have, of course, some bit of understanding of IT concepts, but they just need to augment that with things like cloud, infrastructure, security, CI/CD orchestration, and things like that. Apart from getting these additional know-how, they need to add certifications to their profile, and they also need to add projects. Of course, the college projects are certainly useful, but apart from that also you can work on your own pet projects and you can add it to your profile. That will make your case much more stronger and will make you much more employable in a DevOps role. So now we talked about how you can make the switch from a non-DevOps role to a DevOps career. Now let's talk about if you're already in DevOps career. And this is the last segment that we are going to do, and I've already made this video pretty long. So I'll end it with this section. Let's talk about if you're already in a DevOps role, how do you progress in your career in DevOps? Now, of course, when you join initially, you will have a lot of exposure to the basic things like setting up pipelines or doing small bit of changes here and there in cloud infrastructure or supporting DevOps processes. Maybe you're not somebody who is setting up things from scratch. But as you grow in your career in DevOps, it is very important for you to have a big picture. As in, what is the entire DevOps platform looks? How does the various components of the DevOps toolchain integrate with each other? Why have you made certain tool decisions? And what are the challenges that your team faces? And what can be the possible solutions of those challenges? As at the starting of the video, I mentioned that DevOps is a challenging career because there is no one silver bullet solution that works for all organizations. Every organization's challenges are unique. And one of the biggest challenges in DevOps is tools integration and how these various tools interact with each other. So it is very important for you to understand how to have a big picture of how all these things integrate and work together. So that is, having a big picture is important. Other thing is tools exposure. Now, the more number of tools that you learn, the better you start getting at things. And when I say tools, I mean tools of all the DevOps related things that I talked about. Be it version control, is not much there. We have GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, but yeah, having know-how of those, having know-how of various pipelines, be it GitLab, CI/CD, or Bitbucket pipelines, or GitHub Actions, or Jenkins, various security tools. If you have exposure to multiple cloud vendors, like if you have exposure to AWS and Azure, that makes your case pretty solid. And not just this, apart from that, application build tools, if you have exposure in different applications, if you are in a digital domain in which you are publishing websites, or if you're in a microservices or applications domain or mobile domain, those kind of things, if the more exposure that you get, the better it is. And as I said, these days, you don't have to wait for your company to provide you exposure in these domains. You can go ahead and work on real life projects on your own. Nothing should be able to stop you. So that is very important, having tools exposure as much as possible. And the last is building things from scratch. Now, when you start your career in DevOps at the initial stages, you probably are already building on what is already built over a period of time, and you're adding some bits here and there. But as you grow in your career, it is very important for you to understand and build things from scratch. And when I say scratch, I mean setting up that root account in AWS or Azure, and then having a multi-account strategy and creating landing zones, creating your base infrastructure, creating your identity management system, authentication, authorization, network security, your security tooling, your pipelines, your logging and monitoring solutions, your performance monitoring solutions, your SRE solutions, all these things from scratch. How do you make them scalable? How do you make decisions as to which tool you should be picking and why? Making cost decisions. FinOps is a big thing. Which service to pick up, and what is the most cost-effective service, and what is the most efficient service based on the various options or choices that you have. Making these decisions and having understanding of these is very important. And it is tied very closely to the big picture that I was talking to you about. Big picture of an understanding of all the things of how they talk to each other and intermingle and to make a DevOps solution, but also the individual components as to how do you set them up and scale and secure them. So it is very important for DevOps engineers to grow in their career to have an understanding of how to build things from scratch. So there you have it. We went through a lot of things of how you can start, progress, and build your DevOps career. What are the various things that you have that comprises of a good DevOps career? What do DevOps engineers do? What are the skill sets that you need? So in the coming videos, I will probably drill down more on some of these aspects, and I'll try to make smaller chunks of these components that I talked about. So yeah, if you have been, thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.